The Pack by E.C. Saulness. Read to you by the author. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky, and the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back. For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. Rudyard Kipling. Part 1. About a Girl. Chapter 1. Bellingham, Washington, March 1995. It was about 10:30 in the morning, early March. According to the calendar, spring was just around the corner, but the slushy snow lingering along the sides of the road made the calendar look like a damn liar. There hadn't been much snow all winter. El Niño, they called it. With the end of the season in sight, people seemed to think they were going to get off easy. No. Winter hadn't been going easy on us so much as it had been waiting to deliver a sucker punch once our hopes were up and our guard was down. I parked my old Chevy Blazer between two newer cars in front of the nursing home. It could have been embarrassing to be seen getting out of the battered old SUV between a pair of overwaxed sedans, but luckily I had left my pride in my other jeans, the freshly washed pair without any holes that I hadn't been able to find for a few years now. Larrabee Assisted Living and Memory Care. The sign at the entrance proclaimed in print big enough for the geriatric residents to decipher, even from a distance. The building was a big 2-story number, built 10 or 15 years ago in a tree-filled area just south of town. It was clean and simple and completely devoid of any sense of character or history. But hey, the view of the bay was nice. I sat and admired the view for a moment as I finished my smoke and scratched my dog Blue behind the ear, just the way she likes. I try to tell myself that I take the old girl along for her sake. The motherly cattle dog is always at the car door before I get there. But if I'm being honest, I take her for me. Blue rides with me whenever I feel like I might need a soothing influence to keep me from losing my temper. I can't remember the last time I left her at home. Blue keeps me calm. Rubbing my fingers through her fur probably does more for me than it does for her. Not that I'd ever tell her that. She's a good dog, but there's no sense in inflating her ego. Keeping calm isn't always easy, and I need all the help I can get. My dogs help, the cigarettes too, but that's not enough. A stiff drink, a couple of Vicodin, or maybe some good old-fashioned morphine when I can get it, are all good tools, especially together. I don't hesitate to use any or all of them when I need to. I'll use anything but needles. They scare the hell out of me. No doubt that sounds dangerous, and for most people it would be. But I'm not most people. I'm a monster. Dangerous is what happens when I can't keep my cool. Places like nursing homes don't look too kindly on walking in with a lit cigarette, a bottle of Jack, or even a dog as sweet and even-tempered as Blue. With that in mind, I toss back another handful of Vicodin with a swig from my hip flask to top off the 3 or 4 I'd taken before I left my trailer, just to be safe. I rolled another cigarette, lit it, and rolled yet another to tuck away for later. Blue looked up at me from where she lay on the passenger seat, disapproving. "Don't give me that," I said, as I rolled the window down for her and snatched a small paper bag from the floor of the passenger side, before getting out of the Chevy to finish my smoke. The cigarette helped to smother a lot of the smells that hit me once I stepped outside. That muffling quality was a large part of why I smoked so regularly, but cigarettes could never completely suffocate the world of scents that perpetually flooded my senses. This close to the full moon, they were less effective than usual. Luckily, at that particular moment, it was some of the more pleasant smells that were the strongest. Icy salt mist greeted me from the nearby bay, and the fresh, sticky, sweet smell of the spruce and fir trees surrounding the building beckoned me to come stalk among their fallen needles. The trees themselves were a sort of grayish mustard color to my colorblind eyes, but they still smelled green. As I neared the building, the ocean and pine smells gave way to the astringent aromas of disinfectants and medications. They covered the faintly lingering scents of tea and coffee, as well as tendrils of steam coming off a bland, tasteless lunch being prepared somewhere in the back of the building. Fumes of processed turkey, mashed potatoes, peas, and an artificially sweet lemon custard that made my stomach recoil still couldn't quite mask the one scent that was inescapable in a place like this. The subtle but unmistakable smell of death. My unsettled stomach growled in conflicted hunger and disgust. Somewhere in a dark corner of my mind, where I tried to keep it sedated and locked away behind bars of opiates and white-knuckle willpower, my inner beast growled its own hunger and unrest in sympathy with my stomach. No, get back. Sleep. I'll feed you soon. Go. Sleep. I pictured myself leaning against a caged door in a vast, dark place, pushing with all my might against the thing behind the bars, all shadow and claw, instinct and rage. There was no reasoning with the beast. It had to be coaxed or forced. Slowly, a welcome numbness suffused my imagined arena, and the beast faded back to sleep as my pharmaceutical reinforcements arrived like a well-timed warm blanket. Better late than never. Sir, there's no smoking here. A small and matronly woman in a pastel uniform stood surprisingly close to me. A gaudy paper shamrock pinned to the breast of her uniform. I had been so absorbed in my internal struggles that I hadn't seen, heard, or even smelled her approach. I hadn't even realized that my eyes had been closed as I'd stood there fighting the beast in the back of my mind. How long had I been standing in front of the automatic doors? My cigarette had turned half to ash in my hand, and the Filipino woman, Jeanette, on her name tag, was glaring at me impatiently. No doubt she assumed I was loaded on some drug or another. She wasn't wrong. Mr. Shepard, you'll have to put out your cigarette. It puzzled me for a moment that she knew my name. The warm blanket on my mind taking the edge off the clarity of my thoughts. Of course she knew my name. I've been coming here for years now to visit Maggie. It'd be odd if they didn't know me by now, even though they were perpetually strangers to me. Wordlessly, I acknowledged Jeanette by dropping the cigarette to the slushy pavement and grinding out the butt with the heel of my worn leather work boot. She huffed at me with evident frustration and judgment that she saw no point in concealing from a bum like me. It's almost lunchtime, sir. If you'd like to see your grandmother before then, you should hurry up. I didn't say anything. Sometimes it was best to let people keep their assumptions. It was certainly easier than lying and infinitely simpler than the facts. I nodded a silent thanks to her and shuffled into the plastic-smelling lobby, letting her walk me to the check-in counter where I filled out the necessary fields in the book. Resident, Magdalena Adler. Visitor, F. Shepard. I kept my eyes low and my unseasonable sunglasses on as I followed Jeanette to the common room. It wouldn't do to meet some old lady's gaze and have the beast look back unexpectedly at her from behind my gray eyes. Some of the people in here could be blown over by a stiff breeze, and seeing something like that might well give them a heart attack. Besides which, the less I saw in a place like this, the better. It wasn't an old building, thankfully, but people came here to die. It was full of ghosts, and they weren't who I'd come here to see. Now, ghosts aren't so bad, but just like anybody else, they can be a pain in the ass if they decide to take notice of you. The thing about looking at somebody, alive or dead, is that they tend to look back at you. If you want to be left alone, it's best to pretend that you are alone. People leave you be that way, whether it's the janitor waxing the floor or the ghostly old man walking through the door to the staff room hoping to catch a peep show of one of the nurses changing uniforms between shifts. That particular old goat had been haunting this place for 2 or 3 years now, lingering far longer already than most specters. He was none of my business. I took the stairs to the second floor, adding to Jeanette's obvious frustration. I hate elevators. Damn cages that only open and close when they damn well feel like it. Chet Baker played the trumpet on the common room stereo from an old record. The large room smelled of tea, ointment, and traces of sickness and urine. A large mirror covered one wall in what was probably an attempt to make the room seem bigger and better lit than it was. I caught a glimpse of my reflection and was briefly reminded of why Jeanette had such contempt for me. My hair was even longer than I'd realized, uncombed and hanging to my eyes and over my ears. The mousy gray color that I saw appeared as a dark red to anybody else. Unruly whiskers covered my face as fully as the smoky sunglasses covered my eyes. It wasn't quite a beard, and it certainly wasn't clean, but it did do something to help conceal the cleft lip which gave me the perpetual semi-snarl I'd had since birth. The right arm I'd broken as a child was noticeably shorter than my left, to me at least. But the loose sleeves of my rumpled field jacket probably hid that detail from others. My wrinkled and stained jeans and button-up work shirt had clearly been slept in more than once. I looked more worn than I'd expected, tired. If I were a stranger, I'd have guessed my age somewhere in the 30s or 40s, and I'd have fallen short of the mark by about half a century. I looked like a vagrant, a junkie, a complete loser, proving that now and then you actually can judge a book by its cover. I looked away from the mirror. Not because of my reflection, which was reason enough to look away, believe me, but because of the other things that I see in mirrors. The ghosts that I sometimes glimpse walking among us are much more present in reflections. They're nearly always there in mirrors, especially in a place like this. And I wasn't the only one who saw more clearly by looking through mirrors. They can see me just as easily. Still, I was ashamed at how disheveled I looked. If there was one person left in the world whose opinion mattered to me, it was Maggie. With that in mind, I combed my shaggy hair with my fingers before vigorously rubbing the film off my teeth with a finger in lieu of a toothbrush. Nurse Jeanette sighed impatiently and gave me a look that told me I was fighting a pointless battle. Still, I tugged a little at the collar of my field jacket and brushed imagined dirt off my shoulder before clearing my throat and nodding to her that I was ready to go on. She rolled her eyes and led me to my destination. There were perhaps a half-dozen elderly men and women in the common room. 2 old men sat in front of a television and talked over it, not caring what was on. The rest sat alone, listening to the music or their own thoughts, perhaps tapping their feet or sipping at plastic cups of tea designed to look like porcelain. A staff member sat in one of the corners, reading Maxim magazine and humming to himself. He closed the mag and made a show of looking busy once he noticed Nurse Jeanette walking in. Jeanette walked us to the windows overlooking the cloudy bay where a willowy old woman sat in a wheelchair. She had a knit blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and a familiar old quilt lay folded on her lap. A pair of thick glasses and a cup of cool chamomile tea sat on a table beside her as she stared vacantly at the clouds. "Lena," Jeanette said, as she reached out and gently touched the old woman on the shoulder. "Look who's come to see you." She turned her head and raised her cloudy eyes to look at me, uncertainly. She seemed utterly lost for a moment, unsure of who I was, where she was, or even who she was. But a look of recognition crept slowly over her face after Jeanette helped her put the glasses on. "There she is," Jeanette said. A tentative smile dawned on the fragile old face, and her lips parted, showing surprisingly perfect dentures. "Paul?" She whispered the name of her long-dead husband. "I guess she's having one of her bad days," Jeanette said. "I'm sorry." Jeanette and the other nurses were used to this. Whenever I came to visit, I'd been recognized as any number of people over the years. Sometimes I was her dead husband, Paul. That was hard. Other times she thought I was her dead father, whom I strongly resembled. That was harder. Now and then she was absolutely certain that I was her older brother. Those times can be the hardest of all. The truth often is. "That's all right," I said. "I'd like to sit with her for a while anyway." "Certainly," Jeanette said with a sad smile. "Lunch is in 20 minutes. Of course, you can stay and visit after if you want to." "No, I won't be long," I said. Her family would likely be visiting her in the afternoon, and seeing them was the last thing I needed. Jeanette nodded and gave that same judgmental and disapproving look she'd given me in the parking lot, and then went to talk to the worker with the magazine. She left him looking chastised and embarrassed, before taking his magazine and going back to her work downstairs. The disoriented old woman in the wheelchair sat quietly and looked at me with familiar gray eyes, smiling faintly, as if it were expected of her. I sat in the chair beside her and didn't say anything until Nurse Jeanette was gone. Then I leaned forward and put my hands on hers. Her skin felt like tissue paper. "Happy birthday, Maggie," I said in her ear as I leaned in to kiss her cheek, using her girlhood nickname. "Happy birthday," she repeated to me. "No, it's your birthday, Maggie." I squeezed her hand. "Not mine." "My birthday?" "Yes." "No," she said in disbelief. "Cross my heart." "How old am I?" she asked. "Today you are 90 years old," I told her. She laughed softly, taking what I had told her as the sort of meaningless nonsense I'd have said to make her laugh when she was 9 instead of 90. Her eyes drifted back to the window, where the dark gray clouds were moving more quickly and a large V-shaped flock of white geese flew past. "I brought you something," I said, as I reached into the small paper bag I'd brought with me, pulling out a deep blue cellophane package and placing it on her lap. "What's this?" "Candies. Your favorite flavor." She furrowed her brow, not recognizing the candy any more than she'd recognized me. Her eyes drifted back to the clouds as Chet Baker played Blue Thoughts over the speakers. I sat with her for a moment longer before a thought came to me. "I'll be right back," I said to her, patting her hand. I walked to the corner of the common room, where Dale, the recently chastised employee according to his name tag, sat sullenly monitoring the room. A table of coffee, tea, and water sat beside him on one side. To the other side was the record player, along with a shelf of old albums beside a collection of books that most of the residents here could never read. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked as I began to browse the albums. I ignored him as I searched the titles. Lots of mellow stuff from before any of the staff were born. The employees seemed to think that anything recorded before their own births would please the old folks who lived here. Old music for old people. But there's old, and then there's old. The songs playing right now were recorded when Maggie and those her age were already middle-aged. I needed something with deeper roots. "Sir?" he asked again as he stood guard over Chet Baker. I'd found what I was looking for. I pulled out the album and handed it to the boy. "Yeah. Play this," I told him, pointing to a track on the record. He examined the cover and took his time about it, flexing his imagined authority over his corner of the universe. I turned to face him and peered over the top of my sunglasses, meeting his eyes briefly. People react in all kinds of ways when they see my eyes. If I'm especially angry, or they are especially skittish, the results can be dramatic. I've seen people faint or piss themselves in extreme situations. One guy even ran into a brick wall in a panic and knocked his lights out. When the beast is rattling its cage in the back of my head, something in the primal part of a person's brain sees a predator when they look in my eyes, something other than human, and it scares the sense out of them. I wasn't especially angry at that moment, just my usual surly and impatient self who didn't want to waste time playing power games with a kid. Whatever Dale saw in my eyes in that brief glance was enough. He didn't say anything else, merely stopped the record player with shaking hands and took old Chet Baker off before putting on what I'd given him. I pretended not to notice his trembling hands, figuring the poor kid should keep some shredded dignity. I filled a fresh teacup with hot water, picked out a packet of peppermint tea, and let it begin to steep before adding a heavy dose of honey. I gave it a stir until it smelled just right. "Here, Maggie," I said, carefully offering her the cup. She looked at me without recognition, but raised the cup to her mouth and breathed in the smell of mint and honey. Just then, Dale finished the task I'd given him. An old, familiar song started through the speakers above us, one that I knew Maggie had loved when she was a young woman. She closed her eyes as she took in the scent of the steaming cup, and I noticed a slight movement in her foot. She began to hesitantly sway it to the music. "I know this song," she said, half questioning. "You always loved Gershwin," I said. I'm a little lamb who's lost in the wood. I know I could always be good. Sinatra crooned a show tune that had been decades old before he'd recorded it. Maggie hummed along almost inaudibly as she struggled to recall the next line, but couldn't quite come up with the words. She furrowed her brow in frustration. Sing it for me? She asked. For anybody else, I wouldn't even have considered it, but I'd always been willing to do anything for her. I cleared my throat. Although I may not be the man some girls think of as handsome, to her heart I'll carry the key, I croaked along with Sinatra, for her ears only. She hummed the next line with more confidence and then opened her eyes, a light coming on in a dark room. Someone to watch over me, she sang in a sweet, brittle voice and met my eyes. For a moment, I didn't hide my eyes from her. For one thing, we don't like to hide things from each other. We never have. But more importantly, I felt that there was nothing there for her to fear, at least at the moment. I'd never hurt her. I was certain of it. But I'd been sure of that with others, and I'd been wrong. I looked away. Frances? She recognized me, using the name that only she and our mother had ever gotten away with calling me. Happy birthday, Maggie. I put my hand on her knee, but kept my eyes lowered. Is it really 90? She asked. You don't look a day over 85, I teased. Sweet talker, she swatted my hand. We sat there together and listened to the song, enjoying each other's company. I think Ella Fitzgerald sings it better than this guy, she said. Beggars can't be choosers. Those colored girls, she said, they sure can sing, can't they? I don't think they like to be called that anymore, Maggie, I said. What's that? No, never mind. We sat in the silence a moment longer, watching the clouds. I unwrapped one of the candies I'd brought for her and offered it. Blackberry, my favorite, she said after tasting it. Always was. How did you know? She said. Maggie, it's me. I took her hand. The lights in her eyes were flickering, growing dim again. I pulled a silver necklace from beneath my shirt, showing her the familiar saint's medal that I'd worn for most of my life. Frances? She asked. Yeah, Maggie, it's me, I assured her. Oh, she sat up excitedly. Did Evelyn come with you? That hurt. No, honey, I said. She's not here. She was, Maggie trailed off, confused. If you say so, I said, trying not to let her hear the hurt in my voice. You two are such a sweet couple, she said. She seems so angry, though. You should apologize for whatever you did. I had nothing to say. Correcting Maggie could only bring her pain. Reality is overrated. She's so pretty, Maggie mused. Always was, I agreed. What's that? Nothing. Well, you be sure to give her my love when you get home. I will, I promised. We held hands. I listened to her smacking her lips as she sucked on the candy, the smell of it mingling pleasantly with the aroma of the peppermint tea. Sinatra was singing My Way now. Do you know my husband? She asked suddenly. Yeah. He's a good man, my Paul. Always was, I agreed. What? She asked, unsure again of who and where we were, as Nurse Jeanette appeared in the doorway with other staff members to gather everybody for lunch. Nothing, I whispered, as I stood and prepared to go. I kissed her on the head. Happy birthday, baby sister. Do I know you? She smiled up at me. Sometimes.